Private cities are better than the state. This is Libertarian View, your source of decentralized and distributed information. There is a lot of debate about which country would be better for us to live. But is the right question for us to ask whether we should really live under a state? The state violates private property, kills anyone who rebels against it, robs the population with tax extortion, and imposes useless laws on the lives of people who are just trying to live well. But even so, there are those who defend it and say that living outside of it is a utopia. First, I would like to unravel these fallacies by addressing the ethical problem of living in a state. We do not intend to make a defense of private property natural law here, but if you want to understand more about the matter, the article A New Justification of Natural Law will be in the description of the video. For now, we intend to stick to the argument of why we believe that the state violates, in fact, the private property of innocent people, assuming that respect for private property is the natural law, given that it has been proven in another time. And that's easy, since we can only ask ourselves, when did we come to an agreement to live with the state? Many Hobbesian elitists might answer that if everything that has been done so far by the state is the result of a social contract. But this is certainly a fallacy. First of all, we are individuals, not a part of an entity acting collectively, with a mind that unites them all into one. So, if only individuals can think and act, it is necessary that, for the social contract to be true, it must have been made individually, which is not the case. Secondly, many argue that we accept the social contract because we vote, but the vote, even though it is voluntary, unlike, for example, in Brazil. We cannot actually elect whoever wants to represent us, but whom the political elite working to maintain the state itself has decided to approve. Furthermore, we are fully convinced, as anarcho-capitalists that we are, that taxation is, in fact, theft. This is because if the state collects taxes against the consent of the person charged, this is no different from an armed robbery, that is, from a threat of violence that forces the recipient to transfer their goods into the hands of the collector of taxes, that is, of the thief. So, if we know that a tax is theft, and that we live in a society of coercive laws that force us to live in a way that we often don't agree with, what would be the solution to get out of this life? The answer is certainly private cities. In the case of a society of private laws, it is necessary to clarify, in this way, what this society would be like. We can now think of a mall, where there is a public space for free circulation, with stores and food courts, but there is no extortion, except for taxes that are levied by the state on merchants and businessmen linked to the contractor. Free trade and the free market predominate there. There is no property violation in the sense that the system works as a means of extortion, as I said, specifically by entrepreneurs. Of course, there is from the state. Now, we can imagine the mall functioning perfectly without the state, with its private security, with its open stores and free movement of peaceful individuals. Does that mean there would be no property infringement? Certainly there could be, but as I have already shown, this would not be a system error under this assumption. Of course, you might be asking yourself, but can't entrepreneurs corrupt themselves? Who would punish them? What I want you to understand is that under the assumption that the mall would be a small-scale private city, or we could also have mentioned a condominium, it is perfectly plausible to imagine the incentives not to be corrupted. The first incentive is the profitability that you would lose to your competitor, the owner of another private city, if you did wrong with your customers, which, in this case, are your citizens. The second incentive is the profitability you would gain by offering decent service. Of course, we can use our private property to violate another, but think of the risks you would be taking if you lived in a free world. No one would be forced to stay with you. It is also possible to wonder how they would be punished. Would they simply get away with it? Just losing customers? Certainly not, as there is an economy of scale in the existence of courts. Instead of each person paying their own security, for example, a much lower fee is paid for the service of the police or private security guard to serve a large number of people. And this is also true for the courts, and these cannot be linked to cities as their property. That's why they may be subject to being under of the law, since the courts judge according to the breach of contracts made with their citizens. In economic terms, it is quite clear that the state does not work. Although a liberal rather than a libertarian, Ludwig von Mises discovered the problem of economic calculation under central planning, a term I prefer to use over economic calculation under socialism. This is because central planning, in general, has no prices, a criterion that Mises used to differentiate which system would have an economic calculation and which would not. Price is the mean term between supply and demand, so the price system would be what could determine what the individual's subjective will is. Taxes, on the other hand, the state's collection criterion, do not have access to the economic value, which, being subjective, is not included in a type of collection that was forced. And it doesn't stop there. There would be disincentive to inflation, since a central bank would not be necessary, since, with individual life, the cattle mentality would diminish. Not to mention that, as central banks have proved inefficient in controlling inflation, I see no reason for a renowned businessman to create his own city with this in mind as an option. Therefore, it is clear all the superiority of a private city over the state, but it is necessary to be aware that this war still needs to be won. Many people still have the mentality that they need to be taken care of by the state, and with that, it grows, especially in times of crisis. What remains for us is to try to make libertarianism better known and practice agorism as a way to get rid of the state in our lives for now, despite being a tough mission, almost an impossible one. However, we cannot cross our arms and accuse the idea of a utopia, as you must recognize that this is the best way to live. Thank you for your audience. This article was suggested and written by Dama de Filosofia, reviewed by Paulo Almeida, narrated by Bab Yoda, and produced by Morgana. If you liked this video, please hit the thumbs up icon below and share the video in your social network. If you want to be notified of other videos, hit subscribe and then the bell icon. See you soon.